Hello, YouTube. My name is Sandra, and I am an up-and-coming astrologer. I usually like to upload at least one video a week, and I like to talk about all things astrology, all things that's just going on out in the zeitgeist, in the universe. And so if you don't care about that, then you may not want to stay tuned for this video. But today, um, I have been heavily thinking about this new cycle, or well, sort of a old cycle, but now reaching a very important point, which is Jupiter opposing Pluto. So, this will be sort of like a three-part talk. So try to keep things on track here. There are just things I want to share about it, some educational things, maybe to start us off. But hopefully at the end of this video, you will have understood a little bit more about Jupiter opposing Pluto, what this transit means, as I've been just sort of all in it and researching it and thinking about it. And now that it's finally here, I want to talk about it. So stay tuned for that. At the end, I will wrap up with maybe some important dates that are coming up that I think will even add a little bit more wood to the fire as this transit builds and builds. So without further ado, let's get into it. So the first part I want to talk about is, as I mentioned, we're going to be having Jupiter in Leo, and it is going to be opposing Pluto in Aquarius. So I have a couple artifacts that I want to share, a little bit about the times around the last time we had Jupiter in Leo, last time we had Pluto in Aquarius, and a little bit about the different planets that's involved, okay? So the last time we had Jupiter in Leo was in 2014. I love to give dates around these times because I think that, excuse me, it gives us sort of a framework, if you will, that we can look back on or think about maybe what was going on in our lives around that period of time. I generally think people who are watching these videos are older than, what is that, 11 or 12. So usually that's around the time it takes Jupiter to go back to the same place it was in, or the same sign it was in. So yeah, so we had Jupiter in Leo in 2014 for the last time it was there. And the last time we had Pluto in Aquarius was in 1777. So I'm not asking anybody to go back there because I don't think any of us could that's watching today. But anyhow, Pluto is a planet that takes a little bit longer to get around the full zodiac. So it was in Aquarius from 1777 and it was there until about 1797. So, obviously nobody living today was alive around that time, but it's always interesting to go back. If you are a history buff, I love history and I love to read about what was times like during that time. And so there are many different things out there if you are into history and you want to go back and sort of look at what was the world like, or what was, the USA like around that time. It was certainly an interesting time. So if you would like, I encourage you, please go back. Pluto was discovered around 1930. So I thought that was so interesting how the last time Pluto was in Aquarius was in 1777, but Pluto wasn't even discovered until 1930. And one of the reasons why, as we know, Pluto was considered at first a planet and then like this dwarf planet, but it was just so far out, it couldn't be seen with the naked eye. So it took a while for, certain technology to be made in order for us to even discover Pluto as a planet. So, and when it was discovered, it was kind of noted as extremely distant from the sun, dark and cold. So those were some of the archetypes I think that was mentioned about Pluto. Of course, we know a little bit more about Jupiter. Jupiter is probably, or is, I think, right, the biggest planet in our solar system. Definitely can be seen with the naked eye, closer to the sun. And one of the, Jupiter is actually in astrology considered one of our social or interpersonal planets. So it is showing how we relate to our society, our communities, our groups, how we discover our values, our beliefs, our truths, our morality, even maybe. It's responsible for things like expansion, stability, security, and even opportunities. So we already sort of know or have come to acknowledge and see some things about Jupiter that makes it completely different from the planet of Pluto. Pluto is an outer planet or a transpersonal planet, and it is mainly showing like a generational period of time, sort of like I just mentioned from 1777 to 1797. That marked a period of time, that marked a generation of people, and just sort of, cultural norms, what life was like, maybe some main events happening around that time was definitely highly significant. So that's when we look at Pluto. It's a period of time, things that, shape a generation, and as mentioned earlier, from afar, Pluto is far from the sun, it's cold, it's dark, moves very slow. It takes a while before we possibly can even notice, like, Pluto's full impression on history, like before it makes its mark. Pluto is the slowest moving planet in the zodiac, and so it takes, I don't know, I think 240 years. It takes a long time before it gets around the complete zodiac, as opposed to Jupiter that takes about, I think it's about 12 years or a little bit more than that to get around the full zodiac. So why is this important? Well, these two planets are coming together in what is called an opposition in astrology, okay? An opposition is exactly what it sounds like. You got one planet on one side and you have the other planet 180 degrees across from that planet. So Jupiter and Pluto came together for a new seeding cycle back in 2020. Usually Jupiter and Pluto will come together for a cycle every 12 to 13 years. And so this particular time they came together in 2020. So, just think about it, right? In 2020, I think the entire world can attest that that was a pretty significant time in world history, right? With like just the discovery of the coronavirus and just, something that really affected a lot of people. 2020 will go down in history, I think, as a time period that we will remember throughout the ages. So at that time, so they came together for a seeding period, which means a conjunction, is sort of like when two planets are coming together, and they make this intense aspect to each other called a conjunction, where they're in the same sign. And I think at that time they were both, oh yeah, I have it on here. So they actually made three conjunctions that year in 2020. So during that time, the first conjunction was April 4th, 2020, and they were both at 24 degrees of Capricorn, okay? And then they came together again that same year, June 30th, and they both were also at 24 degrees of Capricorn, but they were in retrograde. They were both in retrograde at that time. And then the third and final time they came together for a conjunction that year was on November 12th, and they were both at 22 degrees of Capricorn, and they were both direct again. So I think it goes into showing just what a very, I guess I like to consider it. I know I definitely felt it in my personal life, but also just from a collective standpoint and from a social, communal world standpoint, just what an epic time it was in 2020, with these two planets coming together and maybe even shaping and changing a lot of things in our now world. So that brings us, friends, to, excuse me. So that brings us to their first quarter square, okay, which was back in May 17, 2023. So if you can imagine or think back, what was your life like around that time? That is when these two planets, Jupiter and Pluto, which came together back in 2020, made their very first square to one another. And they both were in the critical 0 degree. And I don't know if you remember, but back in 2023 is when Pluto actually went into Aquarius for the first time since 1777. So it sort of peeked its head in Aquarius, in 2023. It retrograded back into Capricorn, and then by 2024, Pluto was going to be in Aquarius to stay. So on May 17th of 2023, Jupiter was in Taurus at the critical degree of 0, and Pluto, newly moved into Aquarius that year, was at 0 degree, but it was in retrograde. It had come into Aquarius, I think in March, and then it was starting a retrograde period to go back into Capricorn for its last time. So they made their first quarter, what is considered their first quarter square, around that time. So, I always like to look at it, for myself, like in astrology, if you are kind of tracking this from a collective standpoint or, a universal, or even just your own personal life standpoint, that first quarter square is when you really see sort of like some tension in this area, in the world, in a community, in your life. So I know for myself, when I go back and I track these dates, there were major things going on. There were major things going on in my life in 2020, but definitely that tension of what 2020 brought was very, that intensity of what 2020 brought was starting to show that tension around 2023 in March. And, depending on how you look at it, tension doesn't always feel good, right? It doesn't matter who you are or if you are one of the most macho gung-ho people, tension is tension. And so from a world standpoint, around May 2023, if you look back or if you're tracking main events, I'm sure there were major things that, were starting to come about, from that, seeding point of Jupiter and Pluto coming together in 2020. So, um, and now, about 3 years later, okay, so here we are. July 20th is when this is going to be exact. So, about 20 years later, this opposition is coming from this cycle. So, it's like, I always look at the opposition as sort of like, the full moon cycle, right? Like when you track the moon cycles, which I do talk about a little bit here on my channel. If you follow some of my videos, I love talking about the moon cycles and what's manifesting in our lives and what's visible. And just, with each cycle, there's something, right? There's the stuff we can't see, there's the tension from the stuff we can't see, and then there's the da 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 da, right? We can see it now. And so now with this Jupiter and Pluto cycle, we are reaching that opposition point. And as you noted, it started back in 2020. So we're 6 years later, and here we are, at this full moon cycle or this opposition cycle, in these planets being exactly 180 degrees apart on July the 20th. Jupiter has now moved into Leo, and it's in a completely different sign, a completely different area of our charts, activating a completely different energy, perhaps when it started, when it moved from Jupiter being in, where did I say it started? In Capricorn to Taurus for that first quarter square. And now here we are in Leo for this opposition point. So it's moved around. And I think, as you'll hear me mention here a lot, on YouTube, on this channel, I don't think there's any surprises or secrets with the universe, right? I think the seeding points, the things that we can't see, the dark times when something is very new and that intensity of it, we can't really see what it's going to give birth to, what it's going to, bring about in our life or in the collective or our world, what have you. But I do believe that the universe doesn't make any mistakes, and I think that each part of these energies are triggered for a particular reason, And so what we have to ask ourselves, especially if we follow astrology or if we follow just main events that we're seeing in the news or whatever, what have you, our own lives, we have to see, what am I seeing? What is very obvious? What was significant in 2020 in my life? And, something around that Jupiter area, my beliefs, my values, and then looking at, that Pluto area, sort of, Pluto can, as I mentioned earlier, can sometimes show this dark period and cold period in our charts. We all come from a different generation of time. And so sometimes it's based off of what generation, what sign Pluto was in when we were born. And so if you don't know what sign Pluto was in when you were born, I encourage you, please go back and, maybe Google. I mean, sometimes it's just as simple as Googling what sign was Pluto in 1953 or whatever, who knows what year you were born. but it kind of gives you a little bit of an understanding of that time period and the energies around that time period. I'm a Gen Xer, so I was born when Pluto was in Libra. And so it's always nice to understand the shadow side of what, Pluto is showing in your own life and in your own natal chart, and how it kind of, gives birth to other areas in your life, or it helps you to sort of unearth, if you will, a certain area in your life. So we have now Jupiter, as I mentioned, in Leo at 4 degrees and 26 minutes, and is opposing Pluto in Aquarius, which is in retrograde right now at 4 degrees and 26 minutes. And this is going to happen on the 20th. So, what is that? Like a few days or so. So, but of course, what does that mean? It doesn't mean, oh, all of a sudden, something major is going to happen, right? I mean, it could, I don't know, right? But it could be something, sometimes there's something that's probably have been presenting itself, or sort of unveiling itself, if you will, becoming more illuminated in this area of our life, in this area of our collective for a period of time now. So sometimes it's as simple as just, realizing like, oh my God, like here it is. Like it's, my belief systems and my values are what have you, they're totally I look at an opposition time as a time where balance has to be figured out, right? So it could be one or the other. This Pluto area of my life is just completely, it have me in the dumps. I'm in the dark, I'm in the cold, it's completely taken over. Or, or maybe it's the Jupiter area of my life to where, you know, I don't know, like maybe one that's taking over, to where it's hard for us to see the reality sometimes of life. So let's delve into, friends, the next portion of this that I wanted to talk about, which was, so I wanted to sort of preface this. We'll look at this in a number of different ways. I'm not going to do like how this may affect you if you have, you know, you're rising in this sign or that sign, because I generally believe that, there's so much going on in our lives. Like it's almost impossible, without having our full natal chart looked at to see how this is really going to affect you. And so I'm of the mindset where if I can't give you, sort of the full thing of like, okay, your sun is here and this is what's going on with your Mars, then I just tend to, you know, kind of steer away from that. Although sometimes I will pop on here and do all signs. I tend to just want to do like more of a generalization and like an overview of how I see these energies. Okay. So, but one thing I want to say that I think is so important is the importance of having planets retrograde in our natal charts. And this is something new that I've been studying on my own, as I have a rising that is in a planet that is in retrograde, and it is my rising sign. And so if you do know your natal chart and you know that maybe you have a Mercury is the ruler of your chart, right? And it was in retrograde, or when you were born, or Jupiter is the ruler of your chart and it was in retrograde when you were born, or Mars, or, even Saturn, I think that you will probably feel, especially if you had Jupiter in retrograde or if you had Saturn in retrograde and they are rulers of your chart, I think you may feel this, in a way that helps you to understand and see yourself a little bit more clear, depending on what area of your chart Jupiter or Saturn is responsible or signifying in your life. Okay. So it just gives you and sheds light on a whole nother layer of information for you that I think is pretty cool and it's nice to discover about yourself. So basically, what I'm saying is, hear ye, all the people ruled by Jupiter or Saturn. This one's for you, okay? You are going to probably feel this opposition. As especially if you have a Jupiter rising or Jupiter is rising, is your rising signs, or if you have Saturn and it is your rising sign. Now, how this may or may not affect you, well, that's really going to depend on other areas in your chart that you would have to have looked at. But I will say that, if, you have things going on in your life and you're just like, wow, why does the energy right now, just feel so potent, just so, what is it? It's so intense, and the tension is so thick you can cut it with a knife, I think is the saying. Why is that? And you could very much so have one of these planets as your ruler. And it does affect us differently, I think, when our ruler is being aspected by major events like a Jupiter, Pluto, um, a Jupiter, Pluto cycle. So just know that, and just know that if it's been a wild ride for you these past 6 years, I don't think the universe makes any mistakes in our energy. Personally, I practice astrology, I study astrology, I follow astrology, and I definitely can see how things have shifted and where things are in my life. And I don't look at it from a standpoint of I'm blaming the planets for what's going on in my life. I just think that it's a major signification for what is happening and what is being uncovered or unearthed for me in my life. And I love to see that because, I look at it as the planets are bodies, right? And we're a body, and energy and vibration and all of those things interacting with one another helps us to feel at home more. It helps me at least to feel more stable and more set in my body when I understand what other bodies are going through, and so it's just that really cool, I think, experience of being a part of being alive, of having feeling and being alive and going through this earthly human experience, right? So you also, with that being said, may want to look at your Jupiter and your Saturn houses in your chart, because Jupiter could be your ruler, Saturn could be your ruler, but you also have these planets in different houses in your natal charts. You have Jupiter or Saturn as a ruler sometimes in other places in your natal chart and signifying different things. So this can also shed some direction on how this time or this aspect is going to affect you or have been affecting you really since 2020. So with that, friends, let's get into sort of like the next section of what I wanted to share. So as I've already mentioned, on July 20th, 2026, Jupiter will oppose Pluto, marking, really the next major touchdown of energies between these two planets, since as I mentioned before. And this will be, we will have one more, I think, third quarter square in 2029, and then they will begin a whole new cycle in a whole new area of our lives. But you know, here on in July 20th, 2026 will be the next major time that, you know, in this next major shift. And I don't know about you, but I've already started to just feel like this sense of something's coming. Like, you know, like there's, I mean, and I know there's so much around the internet right now where people are talking about how is it, Barbo's basket or something like that. And you know, and a lot of people are listening to that. And but I am one where I tend to want to tune in more to my own life and sort of just understand and, you know, look at my life from a perspective of literally what is happening in my life. And I definitely have felt the energy from this time. And you know, whether it's dealing with your family, right, or dealing with your job, or dealing with, you know, just the world in general, you know, the world we live in, the communities we're a part of, just life in general. And I definitely have felt, I will say that the times that we are in right now is definitely, I think there is this tension and this, I think this time that has illuminated from 2020, that is very clear, you know, very obvious. There's no going back. There's no sort of like, you know, oh, I'm going to wake up tomorrow and, you know, this is all going to be over. No, I think it's just going to become more and more intense as, you know, this cycle continues. And so with that, it prompted in me a time of just wanting to share, make this video and talk about it a little bit on how I see the energies actually playing out. And so if you've stuck with me this long, I'm going to talk a little bit about that right now. So perhaps, you know, you could be asking yourself now, where and what areas of my life, right, or someone else who's a part of my life or the collective is all of this illuminating for at, you know, or maybe you aren't, you know, maybe you're like me. Maybe it's so visible in your life right now to where you're like, wow, I hadn't even thought about how different life was in 2020. And now we're in 2026. And we're at this opposition time between Jupiter and Pluto. And, you know, here, so be it. You know, this is what I am seeing. This is sort of the unearthing, right, from Hades, right, from Pluto, you know, which is a planet that is a very intense planet. As I mentioned, a very small planet, wasn't, you know, discovered, you know, that long ago, really, if you think about it, but still holds a powerful punch and still helps us. The more we study it and the more we understand it, you know, we realize sometimes just how much effect it can have on us. And particularly, I think if you are having Pluto sort of touch some of your personal planets right now. And what I mean by your personal planets, I mean, you know, your luminaries, your sun and your moon, your Venus, your Mars, your Mercury. And when, you know, you're having Pluto interact with some of these planets, it can really just bring about this unearthing of another side of you that perhaps you had no idea was there. And, you know, but hey, that's Pluto, right? So an opposition is meant to illuminate. It's meant to highlight something. to bring something into complete view, when we think of the moon cycles and we think of the full moon, it's when the sun is opposing the moon. And it is, at that time, we're able to clearly see the moon. We're able to see it for all of the beauty. I love looking at full moons that it is. But the energy is heightened. I think the energy is intense. And, you really do see things in your life, I think, that sort of require sometimes a response that maybe you hadn't realized before. If you follow full moon rituals, I know for myself, I do at times. And I look at the full moon time or the opposition time as a time of seeing what's out of balance in my life, a time of seeing what I need to release or what I just cannot hold on to anymore. Sometimes the universe comes along and it's like, I don't have to decide, right? It's completely leaving my life. And it's there to get us to understand that, the life comes in cycles and transitions and new beginnings and, all of what's in between or at the end. And so full moon periods or oppositional periods can be just as intense as that time. So yeah, so you can feel like there is a lot going on right now or playing out in like this big dramatic way in your life right now. Or just, even if it's not a loud drama, right? It's this like Mercury is retrograde right now. It's like this, what I like to call it, like this sizzling under the surface, like it's gonna a little bit, just a little bit more and it's just gonna explode, right? Perhaps things can be taking a different shape around family like issues in your life, right? Or relationship issues in your life, community or issues revolving groups and organizations, there is this tension, I believe, in these particular areas in our life right now that this opposition is highlighting that is it has so much tension. You really can cut it with a knife. It's created its own, solid, its own object of just like, we just got to let it out. We just got to let it out. So things feel just that heavy and intense. And it's taking on a physical form of illumination, something that we can fully see and something that we can no longer sort of just hide behind. I think Pluto really is that planet of sort of unearthing things that are hard to deal with, whether that be trauma or addictions or obsessions or power struggles or what have you. I think that Pluto is there to show us these different areas in our lives and to help us see that, there's not a whole lot we can do about that other than face it, and realize it, and see it, in terms of things like addiction or trauma. If you're a therapist or you work in this career or this background, that these are areas in our lives that we just have to face them. We can't really hide behind them, especially when Pluto unearths it for us, right? And we certainly can't just do something very, so something like where we try to make it prettier or take out all the fluff, or not take out all the fluff, but you know what I mean? Like make it nicer, or, sometimes it has to fully unearth, and sometimes it has to be brought through the whole cycle of Pluto, a destruction, um, even a death, but ultimately so that it can be rebirthed and transformed. So, um, Mercury is retrograde at this opposition right now, friends, as I've mentioned. And, Mercury rules things like our thinking, our communication, and many other things, our children or siblings or what have you. Our thoughts can really take on, like, a body, it can really take on our actions right now. It's almost like your thoughts becoming your actions, like my thoughts are so, when Mercury, I feel like, is retrograde, things are sort of inward. So it's like you're doing it through, so your actions become what you're thinking, you know? I don't know how to make that make sense, but it's like, you know, our mind is, Mercury is more than just our minds. Our brains rule more than just our thoughts, but it can cause physical things to happen with our bodies as well, I think is one way to look at it. So, maybe our thoughts around our families, our relationships, as I mentioned, our communities, organizations in our communities, um, perhaps our ways of thinking and feeling on how we respond, right, to these areas in our lives. Um, Maybe it is, and this is something I thought about as I was meditating on this energy and looking at this energy. Maybe it's rooted in past conditioning, um, people pleasing, pleasure seeking, um, transactional type relationships, right? Trying to fulfill a duty or a responsibility where there is inadequate structure, there's inadequate resources, there's not enough time, there's not enough knowledge on it, there's not enough nurturing. You know, I look at this time as I was meditating on it as, sometimes it will bring up, I think, feelings around this time, to where we respond and we react out of, ways of this kind of conditioning. So around this time, as I mentioned, we're also moving into our first quarter square from that new moon in Cancer that we had. And I made a video about that if you want to go back and watch that. But we had a new moon in Cancer on July 14th, I believe. And, around this time of this opposition, I believe it's going to be either it's the same day or the day right after we move into the first quarter square of this opposition. And so that's another thing that, as I mentioned before, the moon governs our cycles and, our structures and our security, and how we feel secure, and our conditioning and things of that nature, right? Our families. So the moon is probably having some tension around this time as we're also going through this Jupiter opposing Pluto. Maybe questions like, how can I nurture? How can I protect? Or even be receptive to those things. When I'm coming from this place, perhaps, of like ambiguity or overbearance, um, maybe even from a place of lack. Just, the moon needs a sense of security. The moon needs a sense of foundation and a sense of structure to feel like it can then give to and nurture what is around it. So we're having this first quarter square from this new moon in Cancer around this opposition period. And so you know, maybe there's a lot of let's see here. Let's go back, friends. Yeah, so maybe there are, there's this sense of like, immaturity. Like, there's a sense of like where I need hands that can feed me, that can secure me, that can help me, that are, that are mature. Perhaps maybe there's a sense of immaturity around this time. There's a sort of lack of, or an inability to truly get strength, and abundance and stability from life, from the giver of life, from the moon. So with this opposition, I think a great thing to ask yourself is, and maybe even at this first quarter square, which I mentioned, I think is going to happen on the 21st of July. What is being illuminated for me, in terms of these different areas in my life? I believe that there is a story, okay, that is unfolding around where power, okay, Pluto can sometimes represent power, but where power has been placed, and it's like, there's a placing of this power in immature hands, right? And, we know what happens when we give power to things that are not fully developed, right? Things that are not mature, things that are not going to understand the needs of perhaps a family, perhaps a community or organization, a country, or even a generation of people. We know what can happen, so there's the true source of power. I think that is what this opposition is bringing up for us. Hopefully it can bring about a sort of rebalancing. I think that, there will be things that will come about that will be able to help, but I think it's first going to take a lot of sort of just illumination of seeing how this power, perhaps, just, I like to say the powers that be, the structures, right, have been out of balance, and people can feel that and they're waking up to that. And people are starting, I think, in wanting a mature power, a natural, real power, that creates a world, that creates a community and a family that can reach like stability and expansion and the things that we so desperately want, the things that Jupiter is there to offer us. So that's that. I had a couple other things I wanted to mention, and then I got to get off of here. I feel like I'm always on here forever with these one videos a week, but I definitely love talking about this, if you can't tell already. One thing I wanted to mention, and that I tend to take into consideration, is, Jupiter is one of our benefic planets, right? And I love to see when the benefics are in any aspect with other planets. I think it doesn't matter if it's an opposition or a square. Technically, I love to see more of like a trine or a sextile, but if it is a square or an opposition, in my mind, at least I tell myself, well, at least it's with a benefic. It is with Jupiter, or it is with Venus, is our other benefic planet. And so I do think that eventually Jupiter will, things will become better. Or I guess what I'm trying to say is that I do have hope. I have a sense of hope. I have a sense of belief and faith that things will balance out just the way they are meant to be. I have hope in that, like I mentioned earlier, the universe doesn't make any mistakes, and it doesn't make any, it doesn't, I feel like there isn't a divine intelligence, I think is what I want to say. And I think because of that divine intelligence, things will be and become exactly how and what they are supposed to be. So that's what I wanted to share about that, friends. I had this little analogy, it's like if we're looking in the mirror, right? Because I think of oppositions, it's kind of like looking in the mirror, right? And we're seeing how what has been manifested, or perhaps what has been done through the beliefs and the seeds of the collective. And, we're looking in the mirror, and perhaps, we look at things that we don't like to see. But we have to remember that we represent what's on the other side of that mirror, right? So, with the opposition, it's like energy feeding energy, right? So it's like, whatever you don't like about something, I think it comes without saying that it's not just one side that has to change, because you are looking in a mirror. So there's a part of you that's a part of that thing that needs to change, that needs to become what is unrecognizable so that it can become better, right? So it takes, to make real change, I think it takes a collective, it takes a world, it takes a universe of people who are willing to look at their values, or look at the values they want, or look at the beliefs they want, or maybe the hopes that they have, and if it doesn't look like what is staring them in the mirror, then they have to decide that this is what has to change in order for a lot of the rebalancing to happen, right? So that's what I wanted to share about that. And then I also just wanted to share some of the transits. I have my little astrology calendar here of some transits that's going to be happening after this opposition. We're going to have Jupiter opposing Pluto on the 20th, as I've already mentioned. And then I think some of the things that's going to really tug on this, or just, draw out more of the tension, is what I wanted to share, is we're going to have the moon go into Scorpio, I believe on the 21st. And then the sun is going to be moving into Leo, which is where Jupiter is already, on the 22nd. And then we're going to have Mercury, thankfully, Mercury, which has been retrograde for the past, 3 weeks? It feels like it's been longer. But Mercury is going to station direct, which I think is also going to, possibly make things move. But it's, again, friends, I just say be careful, because when things have been sort of moving from a standpoint of not really of analyzing, but not really dealing with all of what's been happening and what's going on. You know, it could just, yeah, it could be a pretty interesting time. So Mercury will station direct on the 23rd of July. And then we will have our nodal shift. So right now the nodes are at this critical degree of North Node in Pisces, and the South Node in Virgo. And so it's been that way for since January 2025. And so here we are now in July of 2026, and it's going to be switching from the North Node being in Pisces to going into Aquarius, and the South Node from being in Virgo to going into Leo. So that's going to be another major, just groundbreaking shift that I think is going to also, you know, sort of add a little bit of something, a little edge to this opposition that's already begun cranking up, right? And then we're also going to have, if that wasn't enough, the sun is going to oppose Pluto, which the sun is in Leo. So we've already had Jupiter opposing Pluto, and now we're going to have the sun oppose Pluto on the 27th. And then last but not least, and this is probably around the time I will be back on here to talk a little bit, is we will have Jupiter conjuncting the sun on the 29th. We will also have the full moon on the 29th, and we will have Mars squaring Venus on the 29th. So we are in for definitely a powerful, powerful ride, friends. I would say astrologically, and yeah, I think, you know, it will be interesting just to, as I mentioned in the beginning, pay attention to your life, pay attention to sort of the archetypes that these planets represent for you. And yeah, so that's all I wanted to share. I will be back on here to talk about the full moon and my thoughts around that, which, as I mentioned, will be on the 29th. And so hopefully I will see you then. All right, peace and blessings.